Thank you for watching African Elements. In this episode, a look at black voting and representation. We'll review the troubled history of black voter enfranchisement and the ongoing efforts to suppress the black vote. We'll look at the ebb and flow of voting rights victories and setbacks. Also, what are we voting for? To what extent are the choices we have on the ballot actually reflecting the interests of black voters? All that begging the obvious question, should black people vote? We'll examine all this and more coming up. Welcome back to African Elements, where we bring free classroom-ready content right here to where you're at. To that end, I want to extend a massive thank you to our newest Patreon subscriber. For as little as $1 a month, you too can support this content. Additionally, a big thanks to all of our YouTube subscribers. We're very near that 1,000 subscriber mark, and that'll be a huge milestone for this channel. Thank you so much for your support. Now, let's get started. The point at which the United States began to move toward more universal black voting rights begins immediately following the Civil War and in the period of Reconstruction. I did do a more thorough video on the Reconstruction and what it actually meant for black folks, so if you'd like a more detailed breakdown on that, I'd encourage you to click the link in the description. For this video, I'm just going to focus briefly on Reconstruction as it relates to voting. By the end of the Civil War, there were some northern states where black men were granted the right to vote and even hold office, but that wasn't universal, even throughout the North. The first steps towards gaining a more universal voting right came in 1867 with the Reconstruction Acts, which defined the terms for which the defeated South could rejoin the Union. Those acts required the former Confederate states to ratify the 14th Amendment, granting citizenship and equal protection under the law for black Americans, as well as voting rights for black men. Additionally, the South was divided into 4 military districts where Union troops were deployed in order to ensure enforcement of the Reconstruction Acts. What that meant initially was the enfranchisement of 735,000 black male voters and the first blacks to be elected to the House of Representatives and the U.S. Senate. Later, in 1870, voting rights were codified into the U.S. Constitution with the ratification of the 15th Amendment, which stated that the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Unfortunately, it didn't take long for southern states to find ways to circumvent the 15th Amendment and its promise of voting rights. As the era of slavery that served as the underpinning of the institutionalization of white supremacy in the South came to an end, white Southerners sought the redemption of institutionalized white supremacy by transforming slavery into black codes, sharecropping, and Jim Crow. As it relates to voting, white Southerners used both legal means to disenfranchise black voters and extra-legal means that included economic retaliation, terror, corruption, mayhem, and outright murder. The legal means by which black men were disenfranchised included such mechanisms as poll taxes and literacy tests. These were measures that were exclusively applied to black voters. But what about the 14th Amendment? Didn't that guarantee that the law would be applied equally to both black and white voters? Well, yes. But Southern redeemers were nothing if not creative. While technically working within the letter of the law, white Southerners devised a way to apply the law equally and still ensure that black men were kept from the polls. The solution was the Grandfather Clause. Many mistakenly believed that the Grandfather Clause was a voting qualification, that if your grandfather voted, that qualified you to vote. That's not quite the way it was applied in practice. In practice, it was actually used as a voting exemption in order to get around the fact that there were plenty of poor whites in the South who were not able to pay a poll tax or pass a literacy test. If that were the case, then by the provisions of the Grandfather Clause, one could be exempted from having to pass a literacy test if one's grandfather was able to vote, a caveat that applied to no black Southern voter in the era of Reconstruction. Creative. Diabolical. but creative. In a second wave of disenfranchisement, much of the South instituted white primaries, in which whites only were able to participate in the elections that determined which candidates were on the ballot for the general election. It was a way of disenfranchising black voters, which by 1920 technically included black women, with the ratification of the 19th Amendment. White primaries ensured that in the general election, black voters would never have a candidate on the ballot that represented them or their interests. A third wave of disenfranchisement followed that included new measures intended to disenfranchise black voters. Those consisted of vote dilution, which could be achieved by either at-large elections, gerrymandering, or through selective incorporation. Holding at-large elections was a way of ensuring that black voters could never be represented in local government. Let's say you have a city with 4 city council seats to represent the population of the city. If you had a section of the city with a majority black population, one would expect that you would have at least 1 city council seat occupied by somebody that represents that section or district. But what if you held an at-large election, where the city wasn't broken down into districts, but held a citywide election with the top 4 candidates winning the 4 city council seats? In a citywide election, you'd have virtually no chance of electing someone that represents a minority district. Another way to dilute a black voting bloc is through gerrymandering. Gerrymandering makes it possible to take this majority black district and, by being a bit creative in terms of where the lines are drawn, create 4 districts with a black minority. Or, similar to gerrymandering, I could selectively incorporate an unincorporated area of the town so as to dilute a black voting bloc. So, as we can see, where there's a will to disenfranchise black voters, folks in the existing power structure bent on preserving their power will find a way. As various means of disenfranchising black voters were devised, black political organizations have vigorously challenged those attempts, and they were often successful, until new measures were devised. Then those measures were challenged. Rinse, repeat. One of the first challenges came in 1915, when the NAACP mounted a legal assault on the Grandfather Clause. In a major victory, the Supreme Court in 1915 declared the Grandfather Clause unconstitutional. Later, the Supreme Court outlawed the white primary in Smith v. Allwright in 1944. Yet, the struggle continued. The struggle for black voters to be free of literacy tests, poll taxes, arbitrary rules, and raw terror was a bruising one that claimed many lives along the way. It was fought through mass mobilization, direct action, and countless acts of individual courage in the face of state-sanctioned violence. A major milestone in that struggle, though, was the Voting Rights Act of 1965. In addition to outlawing poll taxes and literacy tests, it also included a provision that would prove critical in the voting rights struggle, the pre-clearance provision. Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act provided that certain states with a history of voting discrimination had to apply to the U.S. Justice Department or the U.S. District Court before making changes in election laws or procedures. That gave federal jurisdiction and oversight that was intended to ensure that future rule changes wouldn't negatively impact or discriminate against a particular class of voters. Although the act required periodic renewal by Congress, it was renewed in 1970, and again in 1975, and yet again in 1982 when the coverage formula was extended to 25 years. And in 2006, the Voting Rights Act was extended for another 25 years. During that time, various attempts to establish new discriminatory voting restrictions, such as ID requirements, had been kept at bay. In 2003, the Supreme Court dealt a major blow to the Civil Rights Act in Shelby County v. Holder when it struck down the pre-clearance provision, and it struck down Section 4B, which established what jurisdictions are subject to pre-clearance based on their histories of voter discrimination. With that oversight out of the way, it took the state of Texas all of 2 hours to implement a discriminatory voter ID law that required a state-issued ID with an expiration date. In addition to the fact that black folks are disproportionately represented among the non-driving population and are less likely to possess an ID in the form of a driver's license, the types of IDs that were deemed suitable were clearly aimed at a particular demographic. Gun licenses, for example, were considered acceptable identification, whereas student ID cards were not. A similar voter identification law in North Carolina was blocked by the court even after the pre-clearance provision was struck down, when an appeals court found that the law's provisions, quote, target African Americans with almost surgical precision, unquote. Given the intense struggle for voting rights over the decades, it's worth exploring how we might best leverage the vote. Of the three basic types of representation most commonly modeled by political scientists, descriptive representation assesses the extent to which a representative body looks like the people in a demographic sense. If it's important to you that the city council or Congress be representative in terms of people of color, women, or LGBT folks, then you might be interested in leveraging your vote based on those candidates that you feel are necessary in need of representation demographically. That doesn't take into account what their political stances are, though. Sure, there may be black folks on the city council, but does that automatically mean that they represent my interests? Symbolic representation addresses the extent to which people have confidence or trust in their representative. It's similar to descriptive representation, but it has more to do with one's feelings about what the representative symbolizes as opposed to what they descriptively look like. The symbols can be arbitrary and not necessarily related to actual policy positions, though. For example, if symbolic representation were important to you, would you be more inclined to vote for a candidate who also happens to be involved in church leadership, as opposed to, say, a person who was formerly incarcerated and has since dedicated their life to community service? Lastly, substantive representation deals with the extent to which laws passed by the legislature or representative correspond to the policy interests of the people. Given that since the Johnson administration, black voters have been the most loyal demographic within the Democratic Party, with 80% of the black population voting Democratic, theoretically that should give black folks a lot of leverage within the party based on balance of power theory. Theoretically, in any election in which the white vote is fairly evenly divided, black voters can and have determined the outcome. In fact, as far back as the Carter administration, no Democratic president has won with the majority of the white vote, with President Carter gaining 48% of the white vote, Clinton gaining 39% and 44% in his two terms in 1992 and 96 respectively, and Barack Obama garnering 43 and 39% of white voters in his two terms as president. So the last three Democratic presidents were elected on the strength of black voters, but given that fact, it's questionable whether Democratic administrations have manifested in substantive representation. If substantive representation is important, then one must also question whether to vote at all, if the representative doesn't substantively represent your interest. Keeping that in mind, here are a couple of thoughts from recent discussions that address different theories in terms of leveraging one's vote. In the first, Professor Khalid Alexander of Pillars of the Community discusses the problems associated with voting for someone who doesn't substantively represent your interest. In the second, Maurice Mo Mitchell, the National Director of the Working Families Party, discusses the dilemma of voting for the lesser of two evils. Links to the full discussion are in the description below.
We're just going to have a little bit more of an organic conversation about kind of the concept of civic engagement in general and the idea of building black power and what does black power mean in the context of the white political system. And so, like I said, it's more of an organic conversation. Pillars of the Community, this right here where we are meeting right now is called the Community Spot. We don't really, in our political education classes, we don't have any particular viewpoint, agenda, or ideology, except for shit is complex. Okay, and so when we have these conversations, we're looking for the complexities of it, And we're not here trying to teach what's right or what's wrong, but really how can we delve into the complexities of issues and the topics that we deal with. The series that we're getting ready, this actually the first night is going to be around the concept of civic engagement in general. As you all know, we have an election coming up in November with a few kind of important choices that people will be making. And so we see this kind of as an opportunity to bring community members together and be able to understand what are the implications to either being involved in that system or deciding not to be involved in that system. I always considered civic engagement voting. I was like, what civic engagement is voting? And based on that, I didn't want anything to do with civic engagement. I thought voting was a waste. I didn't understand its importance. I didn't see any of those types of things. We're voting and electing people that aren't going to represent me, that aren't going to represent my concerns, and don't even care about me or my concerns. So why would I be at all interested in being involved in them? Plus, what am I going to say on the day of judgment if I'm involved in electing someone that ends up doing, as a moral religious person, if I end up electing someone that's going to end up creating chaos, that's going to be responsible for the murder, that's going to be responsible for incarceration and the slaughter of people in other parts of the world, right? So these were some of the ideas and thoughts that were going through my mind when I was thinking of civic engagement. What I didn't realize is, like the sister was saying, that's not what civic engagement is. Civic engagement isn't only voting, right? It's being involved and having a love for your community, seeing things that you see that you don't like, that you think should be changed, and doing something to change them. So again, going back to my original views as far as voting, I wasn't like an anti-voter, right? But if I was walking along campus, this is just a few years ago, as a professor, and they're like, can you sign this? Are you registered to vote? I said, no, I don't believe in the political voting system. But then, as I began to get involved in the larger kind of concept of civic engagement and work with other organizations, I got invited to an event that the ACLU put on in Sacramento. That was around incarceration. I think I actually went with Greg, the lobby there. We went up there and I'm like, look, they're talking about the same issues that we're talking about. At that same time, there was a proposition called Prop 47. The proposition didn't change some of the archaic drugs, but it didn't attack the system directly as much as it could have. But what was heavy for me is that was the first time that that's actually the first time that I voted. I might have voted when I first turned 18 because my mom threatened me. Right. But since 18, that was the first year that I ever voted, and that was the only thing I voted for.
But the overt white supremacy of the Republicans is so offensive to most black people that it's like a bridge too far, right? Which is what safely keeps these black people as Democrats. It's one of the reasons why Democrats take black voters for granted, because they're like, where else are you gonna go? Right? Like, come on, right? And then because basically half of the country has to choose one of these things. In the Democratic coalition, we got all types of folks with all types of political persuasion. There's people who are radicals who ultimately like still go to vote and they vote for Democrats, right? And so, right, and like, and often don't talk about it, but do, like, and listen, like, I want to be clear, like, there's a, and I'd love to have this debate, but we don't have time for it, right? In a winner-takes-all, two-party system, I'm not, like, when the choice is Trump and whoever the Democrat's going to be, I'm not voting for that Democrat. I'm an organizer. I'm voting for which terrain of struggle do I want to be on. Do I want to be, because I'm organizing 24/7, 360 days. I'm going to be organizing before the election, during the election, and after the election. Is it more advantageous for my long-term political position and for my community to organize under a Trump presidency, which is what we know it will be, or some run-of-the-mill Democratic neoliberal president, right? That's what I'm debating, and I think it's a legitimate thing to decide what you want to do. But what you're not saying is, to me, when I vote, I'm not saying, I like this person, I believe in them. I'm placing my political faith in them.
So, what are your thoughts? Should black people vote? Under what circumstances? What's your theory for best leveraging the vote? I'd love to engage in some dialogue in the comments below. As always, thank you for watching, and if you're so inclined, please drop this video a like and consider subscribing. Until next time, I'm Darius Spearman.